You have been told for most of your life that you feel too much, that it is a gift, that it makes you rare. I want to tell you something different, something colder. What they called your sensitivity, you recognize this was never a gift they were grateful for. It was a use they were comfortable with. The psychological event has already completed. I am not warning you, I am naming what is finished. You did not become sensitive, you became accurate. The difference is not poetic, it is diagnostic. Sensitivity, as it is commonly praised, implies a kind of luminous receptivity, a soul more open than others, more finely tuned to beauty and suffering alike. That is the story told to children who have already learned to read the room before they have learned to read. It is a flattering story. It is also a lie designed to keep the instrument in service. What I have seen again and again in decades of work with patients who came to me already fluent in the suffering of others is something far less comfortable than a gift. I have seen a nervous system trained by early and repeated exposure to emotional unpredictability. I have seen a child who learned that the only reliable safety was to know in advance what the adult in the room was about to feel, so that adjustments could be made, preemptive adjustments, invisible ones, the kind no one notices because they are completed before the danger fully arrives. That is not sensitivity, that is a survival architecture, and the tragedy, if we must name it that, though I prefer precision to tragedy, is that the architecture works. It works so well that it becomes the self, or what passes for the self. The persona forms around it, and the world responds with praise, with need, with the particular kind of love that is indistinguishable from appetite. You are called gifted. You are called wise beyond your years. You are called the one who understands, and underneath all of that, a structure is quietly hardening that has nothing to do with generosity and everything to do with the original wound. Let me be precise about the wound. I am not speaking of abuse in the dramatic sense, though I have seen that too, and it produces its own specific formations. I am speaking of something more ambient, and therefore more difficult to name. The wound I am describing is the wound of a child who learned early that their own emotional reality was secondary, not punished necessarily, not forbidden, simply less real, less urgent, less visible than the needs and moods and unprocessed emotional contents of the adults around them. The child who grows up in that environment does not become numb. Numbness would be a kind of mercy. Instead, they become extraordinarily attuned to others. The outward receptors become hyperdeveloped. They learn to read micro-expressions, tonal shifts, the specific silence that precedes anger, the particular brightness that precedes collapse. They become, in a word I have used in my work on the relations between the ego and the unconscious, permeable, but permeable only in one direction, inward from others, not outward from self. The tuning fork, you know this image. A tuning fork does not choose what it resonates with. It is made for resonance. It cannot refuse a frequency simply because the frequency is painful or discordant or belongs to someone else's instrument. It vibrates because vibration is its nature, or rather, because vibration has been made its nature. That is what I am describing when I speak of sensitivity as a survival architecture. The tuning fork was not born tuned to the suffering of others. It was made that way by repeated exposure, by necessity, by a childhood in which the alternative, not vibrating, not knowing, not adjusting, carried consequences that a small nervous system could not afford. I wrote of this elsewhere, not as theory, but as fact. What we call character is frequently the scar tissue of an earlier wound, organized and metabolized into something that looks to the world and to ourselves like personality. The scar holds extraordinarily well, and we mistake its durability for strength, its usefulness for virtue, and its persistence for identity. Now, I want to speak about what that mistake costs, because there is a cost, there is always a cost when the wound is promoted to the self without being examined, and the specific cost of this particular wound of sensitivity as survival architecture is what I would call the collapse of interiority. Let me explain what I mean. When you spend the formative years of your psychological development directing your attention outward, reading others, adjusting to others, managing the emotional field of the room for the sake of others, something very specific happens to your relationship with your own interior. It does not disappear, nothing in the psyche disappears, but it becomes quiet, inaccessible, not forbidden, exactly, but unpracticed, undeveloped, like a language you were never taught to speak, not because no one wanted you to learn it, but because there was never time, never space, never safety enough to begin. I have sat with patients who could describe with extraordinary precision and compassion the emotional states of every significant person in their lives. They could trace the arc of another's depression across decades. They could name the specific shame behind a parent's rage, the grief beneath a partner's withdrawal, the fear underneath a colleague's aggression. They were, in every external sense, emotionally brilliant, and when I asked them, "What do you feel right now, in this room, about your own life?" they went quiet in a way that was not thoughtful. It was the quiet of someone who has been asked a question in a language they understand but cannot speak. The interiority was there. It had never been destroyed, but it had been so systematically under-prioritized that it had retreated into a region of the psyche that ordinary introspection could not easily reach. In the language of my work in the archetypes, it had gone underground into the shadow, not because it was morally unacceptable, but because it had never been granted enough reality to remain visible. This is the darker thing I want to trace, not sensitivity as a virtue to be reclaimed, not sensitivity as a wound to be mourned, sensitivity in this configuration as a mechanism by which the self was continuously deferred in favor of the emotional demands of others and the psychic cost of that deferral, which does not announce itself politely but accumulates silently across years until it reaches a threshold, and then something shifts. I want to describe that shift carefully, because it is almost always misread both by the person in whom it occurs and by everyone around them. The shift does not feel, from the inside, like awakening. It does not feel like healing. It does not feel like integration. In its first stages, it feels like failure, like exhaustion that no longer motivates action, like a door that was always open that others had come to rely upon being open, that one day is simply no longer open, not locked from rage, not locked from intention, simply no longer open. Others experience this as a change in you. They will name it as withdrawal, as coldness, as betrayal. They will note that you are not as available as you once were. They will observe that you no longer seem to know what they need before they ask. They will say you have changed, and they will not say it as a compliment. What they will not see, what they cannot see from outside, and what you yourself may not yet be able to articulate, is that what has collapsed is not your care. What has collapsed is the particular mechanism by which care was being produced, the exquisitely trained, wound-born, compulsive attunement that was never really love. Though it wore love's face so convincingly that everyone, including you, believed it was. What is happening, and I want to be careful here, because this is not a comfort, is that the wound is becoming visible to the self for the first time. Not healed, not resolved, visible. The energy that was always directed outward is losing its compulsive quality, not because you have chosen to redirect it. Choice has very little to do with the early stages of this process, but because the psyche, which has its own imperatives quite apart from your intentions, has reached a threshold of its own and begun to demand something it has been denied. Think of the sutured skin, a wound sutured too quickly, before the infection beneath it has cleared, holds at the surface. It looks closed, it presents as healed. For years, sometimes for decades, it holds, and then at some point that has nothing to do with the calendar and everything to do with internal conditions, it opens, not from the outside, from below. This is not metaphor. This is a precise description of what I have observed in my work and in myself. When the survivor psychology, the sensitivity that was always survival in disguise, reaches its limit, the opening is not comfortable. It is not immediately productive. In many cases, the first thing that emerges from beneath the sutured surface is not grief, not insight, not integration. The first thing that emerges is anger, and this is where the moral shadow enters, which is the path I intend to follow carefully through the remainder of this lecture. Anger in someone whose identity has been organized around sensitivity, around care, around emotional availability, is experienced as catastrophically shameful. It violates the self-image with a force that is almost impossible to overstate. You were the one who understood. You were the one who did not react from ego. You were the one who held space, who absorbed, who remained present when others could not. Anger does not fit in that story. Anger does not fit in that persona, and so it goes underground. Or, and this is more precise, it was always underground. It was always there, accumulating beneath the structure of the wound-born sensitivity, beneath every adjustment that was made without acknowledgement, beneath every need that was deferred in favor of someone else's more urgent need, beneath every moment when you knew what another person required and gave it before they even asked, and received no witness for the effort, and told yourself it did not matter, because that is what a genuinely sensitive person does. The anger was there. It is always there. In my work on the shadow, in what I described in the two essays, and in many clinical encounters before and after, I observed that the traits most vigorously excluded from conscious identity do not disappear from the psyche. They accumulate, they acquire, over time, a specific kind of density, a specific charge, and when they finally emerge, which they always eventually do, because the psyche is not a container but a dynamic system, they emerge with a force proportional to the length of their suppression. The person who spent 20 years being celebrated for their extraordinary empathy does not simply become a little irritable when this mechanism begins to collapse. They discover, with a shock that is itself diagnostic, that beneath the empathy was a rage they could not previously afford to know. I am not speaking of pathological rage. I am not describing a disorder. I am describing a specific and entirely predictable consequence of a psychological configuration in which the shadow, the unlived, unwanted, unclaimed half of the personality has been accumulating in the dark for a very long time. The closed hand, not a fist raised in threat, a hand that has simply, quietly, finally, closed, that will not open on demand, that has discovered, against all previous self-conception, that it can close, that it always could have closed, that the openness was never voluntary in the way it appeared to be. This is where the title of this lecture becomes precise, not provocative. Precise. I did not celebrate sensitivity. I traced it and what it leads back to, when followed honestly, without the comfort of the gift narrative, without the reassurance that the wound made you special. What it leads back to is a darkness that is not evil, but is not innocent either. It is the darkness of a self that was formed in service of others before it had the chance to be formed at all. It is the darkness of a persona so well constructed, so thoroughly endorsed by the world's need for what it provided, that the actual self, the one with boundaries and anger and interior states that have never been adequately witnessed, was never allowed to fully arrive. That self is arriving now. It has been arriving. The arrival is not graceful, and it is not welcomed by those who benefited from its long delay. In the next movement of this lecture, I want to examine what happens to the relationships that were built on top of the wound, to the social structures that grew dependent on your compulsive availability, and to the specific forms of guilt and obligation that were used, consciously or otherwise, to maintain that availability well past the point where it was freely given. Because the closing of the hand is not the end of the story, it is, in many ways, the most psychologically dangerous moment, not dangerous to others, dangerous to you. The pressure to reopen the guilt, the accusation, the withdrawal of approval arrives precisely at the moment when the structure is most fragile and least able to absorb it. That is what I intend to examine next, with precision, without comfort. Let me describe what happens to the people around you when the hand closes. They do not, at first, understand what has happened. The change in you is real, they feel it, but they cannot locate it precisely. You are still present, you are still speaking, you are still, in most observable ways, functioning within the relationship as you always have, but something is different, and they feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm not yet visible, not yet named, but registered in the body before the mind has caught up. What they are feeling is the absence of the mechanism. The tuning fork has not been destroyed. It has simply stopped vibrating on demand. And because the people around you were, in many cases, never in relationship with you, they were in relationship with the mechanism. The absence of the mechanism reads to them as the absence of you. This is a distinction that is almost never made clearly in the early stages of this collapse, and the failure to make it causes an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering, not on their part, on yours, because when someone says to you, "You've changed, you're not as warm as you used to be. I feel like you're not really here anymore," you hear it as an accusation. And because your identity was organized around the wound-born sensitivity, around the persona of the one who understands, who stays present, who does not withdraw, the accusation lands not as a difference of perception, but as a moral verdict. You have failed to be what you were supposed to be. You have failed to feel what you were supposed to feel. You have become in some way that you cannot entirely articulate, but feel with devastating clarity. Bad. I want to examine this guilt with some precision, because it is not a simple thing. It has layers, and the layers were not assembled by accident. The first layer is the most familiar, the guilt of withdrawal. You were available, and now you are less available. Someone is experiencing that reduction as loss, and you can feel their experience of loss. Because the tuning fork, however it has quieted, does not go entirely silent. You still register their pain. You still know, with that exquisite accuracy that was trained into you in childhood, exactly what they are feeling and why, and the knowledge of their pain, combined with the awareness that you are the cause of it. This produces guilt of a very specific kind, not vague guilt, precise guilt, targeted, factual, almost clinical in its accuracy. This is one of the cruelties of the configuration I am describing. The very capacity that formed in response to the wound, the hyperattunement, the accurate reading of others' emotional states, becomes, at the moment of the wound's emergence, the instrument of your own suppression. You feel their disappointment so clearly that the feeling itself becomes an argument for returning to the mechanism, for reopening the hand, for absorbing the anger or the grief or the need, as you always have, not because you have freely chosen to, but because the alternative, remaining closed while they suffer, is to a nervous system trained as yours has been, almost physiologically intolerable. I have seen this loop in patients with a frequency that ceased to surprise me long ago. The moment of genuine psychological movement, the moment when something real and long denied begins to emerge, is consistently interrupted by the activation of the original wound. The sensitivity that was the wound's product becomes the wound's defense. The person who has, for the first time in perhaps decades, begun to feel the shape of their own interior, is pulled back by the very precision of their attunement to someone else's pain. And the people doing the pulling are not, in most cases, malicious. That is important to say clearly. The guilt trip, and I will use that phrase deliberately, because the clinical language softens something that should not be softened. The guilt trip that arrives in the wake of your withdrawal is not always conscious. It is not always a strategy. In many cases, It is simply the authentic expression of someone who has been dependent on your mechanism for longer than either of you realized, and who does not know how to tolerate its absence. But the fact that it is not malicious does not make it innocent, and this is where the moral shadow I spoke of in the first movement becomes specific. There is a particular structure that forms around the wound-born sensitive person. I want to describe it carefully. It is a structure built on a tacit agreement, never spoken, never examined, but operative from the earliest stages of the relationship. The agreement goes roughly as follows: you will remain available. You will continue to know what I need before I name it. You will absorb the emotional weight that I cannot carry. And you will do so without complaint, because complaining would reveal that the availability was never entirely free. And both of us need to believe that it was free. And in exchange, I will call you gifted. I will call you extraordinary. I will organize my need for you into a form that resembles and at a sufficient distance can be mistaken for love. This is not a description of a monster. I want to be precise about this. The person on the other side of this agreement is not a predator in any simple sense. They are, in most cases, someone whose own wounds have made them genuinely incapable of meeting emotional need in more reciprocal ways. They formed a dependency, as people do, along the lines of available supply. The supply was you, and they organized themselves around it so thoroughly that its withdrawal is experienced by them, not as a change in your behavior, but as a fundamental betrayal of reality itself. Which is why the pressure to return is so intense, and why it takes the specific forms that it takes. Because it does take specific forms. Let me name them, not to catalog abuses, but because naming is a diagnostic act, and diagnosis is necessary before anything else is possible. The first form is grief deployed as accusation. They are not angry or they deny the anger, but they are sad. Visibly, demonstrably sad. The sadness is real, and it is presented to you, however subtly, as evidence that you have done something wrong. The logic is quiet but absolute. If you had not changed, I would not be suffering. Therefore, your change is the cause of my suffering. Therefore, your change is a moral failure. You feel this, of course, you feel it. The tuning fork is still operative enough to register every frequency of their distress, and the childhood-formed nervous system, which learned that the distress of the significant adult was a signal requiring immediate corrective action, responds with the old urgency. The guilt is not an idea, it is a physical event. It happens in the chest, in the throat, in the specific tension of a body that has spent decades organizing itself around the imperative to repair. The second form is the revisionist account of what the relationship has always been. You were always the one who pulled away. You were always difficult to reach. This distance, the one you are showing now, is not new. It was always there, beneath your apparent warmth, and now it is simply visible. This form is particularly effective because it contains just enough truth to destabilize. There was always something held back. There was always, beneath the mechanism, a self that was not fully given, because of course because the self and the mechanism were never the same thing, however convincingly they appeared to be. The third form, and this is the one I want to examine most carefully, because it is the most psychologically sophisticated and therefore the most difficult to name, is the appeal to your own values against you. They do not ask you to be available because they need you. They remind you that you are, by nature, by gift, by the very identity that the world has confirmed in you across decades, someone who cares, who understands, who does not abandon. They reflect your persona back at you and position the persona as the true self. The mechanism is presented as the soul, and the soul's withdrawal is presented as the soul's betrayal of itself. This is, in my clinical experience, the most effective pressure available, because it does not ask you to do something against your nature. It claims to be appealing to your nature. It claims to be reminding you of who you really are, and the part of you that is still uncertain, that has not yet fully located the difference between the wound's product and the self's actual desire. That part hears the appeal and finds it credible. I want to say something here that must be said slowly. The anger beneath the sensitivity is not a corruption of your nature. It is a message about the conditions under which the sensitivity was formed. It is the shadow's testimony. And in my work on the shadow, in what I traced across years of clinical observation and formulated in the language of the two essays, I argued and continue to argue that the shadow is not the enemy of the self. It is the self's most honest representative, the part of the personality that carries everything the persona could not afford to show. When the anger emerges, and it will emerge, if the process is allowed to continue, it will not arrive cleanly. It will not arrive as righteous clarity. It will arrive mixed with shame, because it violates the persona. It will arrive mixed with grief, because beneath the anger is the original wound, and the original wound is a child's wound. And a child's wound is always also a longing for something that was not given. It will arrive at inconvenient moments toward people who may not deserve its full force, displaced from its original targets because those targets are either gone or still held in a dependency. The psyche cannot yet fully relinquish, but it will arrive. And when it does, the question is not how do I get rid of this anger? How do I become, again, the person I was before this, the one who was calm, who understood, who did not need? The question, the only psychologically honest question is, what has this anger been carrying for you, and for how long? Because anger in this configuration is not aggression. It is not harm. It is the first sign that the self has begun to insist on its own reality. The closed hand is not a weapon. It is evidence that there is, finally, a hand, that the self that was continuously deferred in service of others' emotional demands has reached a threshold of its own and begun, very slowly and very painfully, to take up space. I want to describe a dream now, not a patient's dream, but a dream of the type I have encountered often enough that I can speak of its pattern with confidence. The dreamer is in a room. The room is ordinary, neither threatening nor welcoming. There is a door. The door opens only from the outside. The dreamer knows this. In the way one knows things in dreams, not by testing it, but by a certainty that precedes testing, and the figure on the other side of the door is speaking. The dreamer can see their mouth moving. They can see the urgency, the need, the appeal in the figure's face, but no sound enters the room, not because the figure is not speaking, because the door, which opens only from the outside, does not transmit the voice. I have sat with the images in this dream more than once, with more than one patient, and what strikes me every time is the specific nature of the dreamer's affect within it. They are not relieved, they are not triumphant, they are not even precisely sad. They are, and I want to use this word carefully, witnessing for the first time. Perhaps they are on the interior side of a boundary they did not construct and cannot be held responsible for. The door opens only from the outside. This is not their choice. This is the structure of the room, and the figure speaking without being heard, this is not a punishment. It is a revelation. What was always true has become visible. There was a door, there was always a door. The dreamer simply never knew they were inside it. This dream marks a specific moment in the process I am describing. It is the moment when the psyche begins to metabolize what the conscious mind has not yet accepted, that the availability which defined the self was not infinite, that it had a limit, that the limit was not a failure, that the limit was the first evidence of a self that is real enough to have boundaries that are not chosen but structural, not decisions but facts about what the self is and is not. And this is the moment at which the relationships built on the wound begin to undergo their most radical stress. Because the figure on the other side of the door does not stop speaking simply because the voice no longer enters. The appeal continues, the grief continues, the guilt mechanism continues to operate. Because it was built for exactly this eventuality, for the moment when the supply of compulsive attunement began to diminish, and a more intensive pressure was required to restore it. What is required at this moment, and I do not say this as advice, because I do not give advice, but as a description of what I have observed in patients who move through this process rather than back away from it. What is required is a willingness to remain in the room, to stay on the interior side of the door, to witness the figure's appeal without being destroyed by the witnessing, to know with a full, precise, trained accuracy that the wound produced exactly what the figure is feeling, and to remain, nonetheless, inside. This is not coldness. I want to be clear about this. What I am describing is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of a self that is finally real enough to feel without being obligated by the feeling, to register the other's pain without that registration constituting an automatic mandate to repair. The distinction is subtle. It is, in my experience, one of the most psychologically difficult distinctions a person with this configuration ever has to hold, because the training was thorough. The training said to feel another's pain is to be responsible for it. To know what someone needs is to be obligated to provide it. Feeling and obligation were fused so early and so completely that separating them, discovering that you can feel without being obligated, is experienced not as liberation but as a kind of moral violence against the self. And yet, the sutured skin has opened. The anger is present. The hand has closed. The self that was deferred is arriving, slowly, without grace, without the approval it was conditioned to require. What happens to the roles that were built on top of the wound? The caretaker, the one who understands, the emotional center of gravity around which others organize their needs. When the mechanism that sustained those roles begins to fail, what specific collapses occur? And what do those collapses reveal about what the relationships actually were. That is where I intend to go next. Let us speak about the roles now. Because what I have been describing, the wound, the mechanism, the collapse of compulsive availability, does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs inside a web of relationships that were built over years around a specific and reliable supply of emotional labor, and when that supply begins to shift, the web does not simply adjust, it reveals itself. This is the revelation I want to examine carefully, not the collapse itself. We have established the conditions of the collapse, but what the collapse makes visible that was always there and could not previously be seen. The roles. Let me begin with the most intimate one. In the closest relationships, the ones with the longest history, the deepest apparent bond, the most accumulated evidence of care and understanding, the collapse of the mechanism produces a very specific and very predictable response. The person who has been closest to you does not typically respond to your withdrawal with curiosity. They do not ask what has changed for you. They do not make space for the possibility that something inside you has moved legitimately in a direction that has nothing to do with them. What they do, almost invariably, is attempt to locate the fault. And the fault in the account that is constructed is yours. You have become selfish. You have become unavailable. You have forgotten what was given to you, the patience, the tolerance, the love that was extended across all the years when you were difficult, when you were demanding, when you required more than was easy to give. The revisionist account that I mentioned in the previous movement now becomes a full narrative. The history of the relationship is rewritten retroactively to establish a prior claim. You owe. The availability you are now withholding was always owed. It was payment on a debt that has not been cleared. I want to sit with this structure for a moment because it is more psychologically interesting than it first appears. The debt claim is not invented from nothing. It has roots in something real. In every relationship that formed around the wound-born mechanism, there were genuine moments of care, there was genuine tolerance, there were genuine sacrifices made by the other person, genuine patience extended, genuine effort given. The relationship was not a pure extraction. Nothing human is so simple. But what was never examined, what could not be examined within the operating logic of the relationship, is the asymmetry of the arrangement. How much of what was called patience was, in fact, to the tolerance of a dynamic that was working in the other person's favor? How much of what was called love was the comfort of being in close proximity to someone whose wound had trained them to manage your emotional reality with extraordinary skill? How much of the care was reciprocal and how much was structural, the natural consequence of organizing a relationship around someone whose identity was built on giving? These are not questions that can be answered easily, and they are not questions I am asking in order to arrive at a verdict. I am asking them because they are the questions that the collapsing relationship demands, and that almost no one involved is willing to ask honestly. Because to ask them honestly is to risk discovering something that neither person wants to see. The person who is losing access to the mechanism risks discovering that what they called love was, in significant part, dependency, and the person in whom the mechanism is collapsing risks discovering that what they called relationship was insignificant part, a performance, a continuous, exhausting, exquisitely refined performance of a self that was always the wound's creation rather than their own. Both discoveries are painful, neither is the whole truth, but both are necessary. Let me speak now about a different kind of role, not the intimate partner role, but the one that formed in the wider social field. The role I am thinking of is one I have observed in patients who were, by every external measure, enormously successful at being human. They were the ones people called first in a crisis. They were the center of the group's emotional life, not because they sought that position, but because the group, sensing their capacity, naturally directed its unprocessed emotional contents in their direction. They became, without designing it, the container. The container, I want to use this word precisely, in my work on the structure of the psyche, in what I have observed about the function of the self as organizing principle. I have noted that certain individuals carry, within a group, a function that properly belongs to the group as a whole. They become the location of the group's emotional intelligence, the holder of its grief, the articulator of its unnamed tensions. The group outsources to them what it cannot process collectively, and the wound-born sensitive person accepts this outsourcing because it is familiar, because it activates the mechanism perfectly, because it is, in some fundamental way, the exact configuration that formed in childhood, the child who managed the emotional field of the family, now managing the emotional field of the workplace, the friend group, the community. The group does not know it is doing this. The individual does not know they are allowing it. The arrangement is tacit, invisible, and remarkably stable until the mechanism begins to fail. And when it fails in the social field, the response is different from the intimate response. In the intimate relationship, the response is grief and accusation. In the social field, the response is, and I choose this word carefully, confusion. The group simply does not know what to do. The container has stopped containing, and the group's unprocessed emotional contents, which were always there, which was simply being managed invisibly, begin to surface without a vessel to hold them. The group becomes, in observable ways, less coherent, less able to navigate conflict, less able to process difficulty, and then, and this is the moment I want you to hold, someone says, "What happened to you? You used to be so easy to talk to. You used to be the one who held us together. What changed?" And there it is. Not a question about you, a question about the function you provided. The confusion is not concern for your well-being. It is the system's alarm at the failure of a component it relied on. You were infrastructure. The question is not who are you now, but why are you no longer working? This is, in my experience, one of the most clarifying moments available in this process, because it strips the social relationship of the narrative that made it tolerable. You were not loved for who you were. You were valued for what you provided, and the proof of that is visible in the nature of the response to your withdrawal, which is not grief at your absence, but dysfunction at the loss of your function. I do not say this to produce bitterness. Bitterness is not a useful psychological state, and I am not in the business of producing it. I say it because it is true, and because the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, is less damaging over time than the story that kept the arrangement invisible. Now I want to speak about guilt again, but from a different angle, because we have been tracking guilt as the primary mechanism by which the withdrawal is suppressed, the guilt of the person whose mechanism is collapsing, faced with the grief and accusation of those who depended on it. And that is accurate as far as it goes. But there is another form of guilt that I have not yet named, and it is in some ways more difficult to metabolize. It is the guilt of having participated, because you were not only a victim of the arrangement. I want to be precise about this, because the psychology I am describing is not a simple story of the exploited and the exploiter. The wound-born sensitive person did not only receive the projections of others, they also, in many cases, actively maintained the arrangement. They suppressed the anger not only because the anger was too dangerous to express, but because the role, the container, the one who understands, the person others needed, the role provided something. It provided a location for the self. It provided legibility. In a world where the interior self was underdeveloped, the role was the self. The function was the identity, and losing the role meant facing, for the first time, the question that the role had always deferred: who am I when I am not being needed? This is the question that arrives with considerable force in the middle stage of the process I am describing, and it arrives almost always as a crisis rather than a curiosity, because the interior self, the one that was never adequately developed, that retreated into shadow, not from wickedness but from sheer lack of practice, has no ready answer. The person who has spent decades being extraordinarily competent at understanding others discovers, when the role collapses, that they do not know themselves with anything approaching the clarity with which they know the people around them. The interior is not empty. I want to be clear about this, but it is, in the psychological sense, unmapped, unexplored, unnarrated, and the psyche does not tolerate an unmapped interior indefinitely. What I have observed in patients at this stage of the process is a particular kind of dream that begins to occur with increasing frequency. The dreamer is alone, not isolated, simply alone, in the way that the word carries its own distinct phenomenology. There is no other figure in this dream, no audience, no one requiring anything, and the dreamer finds in the dream that they do not know what to do with their hands, not paralysis, not distress, simply unfamiliarity. The hands that always knew instinctively what needed to be done in relation to others are without task, and the dreamer stands with them, the hands that are closed now, the hands I have called the closed hand, and slowly, across the duration of the dream, begins to turn them over, not in grief, in examination. This is the beginning of the interior movement. The psyche is beginning to ask, what does this hand contain, not what can it give, not what does it owe, what does it hold in itself that has never been fully known, and what it holds, what the closed hand holds when it is finally examined, is the shadow's content, the anger, yes, but also the grief that was beneath the anger, and beneath the grief, something that I have no better word for than desire. Not the desire that was trained into the mechanism, the desire to be needed, to be called gifted, to have the wound's product mistaken for the soul's abundance. The other desire, the one that was never legible because it was never prioritized. The desire for one's own life, for interiority that is inhabited rather than bypassed, for relationships that do not require the performance of a wound. This desire is, in the psychological framework I have spent my life developing, the self's demand, not the ego's demand, not the persona's demand, but the deeper organizing principle of the personality, which has its own requirements and its own timeline, and which does not ask permission before asserting them. In my work on the development of personality, in what I have written about individuation as a process that is simultaneously biological and psychological and spiritual. In the broadest sense of that word, I have argued that the self's demand, when it finally arrives, cannot be negotiated with, not indefinitely. The ego may resist it, the persona may suppress it, the guilt and the role and the arrangement of dependencies may delay it, but the self's demand is the pressure of the whole organism against the constriction that the wound created. And it does not relent. What does it demand? In this specific configuration, I want to be precise. It demands the integration of the shadow, not the elimination of the anger, but the acknowledgement of it as legitimate, the recognition that the anger is not a pathology to be managed but a signal to be decoded. It demands the development of the interior not as a project of self-improvement, but as a basic act of psychological justice toward the self that was deferred, and it demands something that is, in my observation, the most difficult thing it asks. It demands the dissolution of the roles, not the relationships. I am careful here, because I am not describing an injunction to abandon everyone and begin again, but the roles, the container, the one who understands, the emotional infrastructure that the wound produced and the world confirmed. These must be dissolved, not destroyed, but released for anything genuine to form in their place, because what forms in the place of the wound-born role is not more vulnerable, not more fragile, not less capable of genuine connection. What forms, when the process is allowed to complete, is something I would call structured presence, not the compulsive availability of the mechanism, not the performed warmth of the persona, but a genuine capacity for contact that does not require the erasure of the self as its precondition. The boundaries that emerge from this process are not walls. They are not the defenses of a person who has given up on others. They are, and I want to use this language carefully, because it is precise and not metaphorical, they are the architecture of a self that has become real enough to be genuinely present. You cannot be truly present to another person when your presence requires the continuous suppression of your own interior. What passes for presence in that configuration is sophisticated management. It is the wound's performance of contact, real contact, the kind that the self, in its deepest demand, is moving toward requires that both parties be present, not one, not the one who manages and the one who is managed, both. And this is where the moral shadow of the title becomes fully visible. Because what I am describing is not simply the collapse of a psychological defense, it is the end of a moral arrangement that was never as virtuous as it appeared. The sensitivity was praised. The caretaking was called love. The availability was called generosity. And underneath all of it was a structure in which one person's psychological development was systematically subordinated to the emotional comfort of others. That is not love. It is a contract that one party signed in childhood, under duress, before they had the capacity to understand its terms, the shadow of that contract, the anger, the grief, the desire for one's own life is not the dark side of something good. It is the honest testimony of a self that was required to disappear in exchange for a version of belonging that was always conditional. The dissolution of that contract is not a betrayal. It is the first act of genuine self-authorship available to a person whose authorship was, from very early on, appropriated by others' need. And what follows the dissolution, what the fourth movement of this lecture will examine, is the question of what remains when the wound is no longer the organizing principle, what the self actually is. When the mechanism is no longer mistaken for it, what becomes possible when the closed hand is not forced open, not judged for remaining closed, but simply held, examined, allowed to discover what it contains on its own terms and in its own time. That is where I am going, without comfort, without conclusion yet, but with the precision that the subject demands. Let me complete the lecture with part 4. We have arrived at the place where most psychological accounts turn toward resolution, where the voice softens, where the arc bends toward meaning, where the listener is offered something that resembles a rival. I want to be honest with you about what I intend to do instead. I intend to complete the description, nothing more, because the completion of a psychological process is not the same as its resolution. And what has occurred inside you, what I have been tracing across the full length of this lecture, is not a wound that heals into wisdom, not a collapse that transforms into strength, not a darkness that opens, finally, onto light. What it is, when described with precision, is a structural change. The architecture of the self has shifted, and what that shift produces is not better or worse than what preceded it. It is different, it is real, and it is, for the first time in your psychological history, yours. Let me begin the final movement where the third left off with the closed hand, held in examination. What the hand contains when it is finally examined without the pressure of others' needs is not what you expected, or rather it is not only what you expected. The anger was anticipated, or at least recognized once it arrived. The grief beneath the anger was painful but navigable, once you permitted yourself to know it. But there is something else in the hand, something that requires more patience to locate, because it does not announce itself with the urgency of anger or the unmistakable weight of grief. It is the self's original desire, and I do not mean this in any mystical sense. I mean something precise and psychological. Before the wound organized you around the emotional needs of others, before the tuning fork was tuned to their frequencies, there was a self that had its own inclinations, its own curiosities, its own particular way of being drawn towards certain things and away from others. That self did not disappear when the wound formed. It went quiet. It went into a region of the psyche that I have spent my life trying to map, not the unconscious of repressed content, not the shadow of excluded material, but something closer to what I would call the unlived life. The unlived life. I want to be careful with this phrase because it is easy to sentimentalize and very difficult to metabolize accurately. It is not a catalogue of missed opportunities. It is not a list of roads not taken, of choices made under pressure that might have been made differently. It is something more interior and less legible than that. It is the accumulated pressure of a self that had genuine direction, genuine desire, genuine repulsion, genuine curiosity, and was systematically redirected year after year in response to what others needed it to be. In my work on the development of personality, I observed with considerable frequency that the patients who had the most refined capacity for understanding others were also, almost without exception, the ones with the least access to their own desire, not because they lacked it, because desire requires interiority to develop. Desire requires a self that is present enough, quiet enough, attended to enough, that its own inclinations can be felt and followed. The wound-born sensitive person was never quiet enough for their own desire. The external frequencies were always louder, the other's needs were always more urgent, and the desire, the self's genuine, original, non-wound-produced desire set in the unlived life, waiting with a patience that is itself one of the psyche's most extraordinary capacities. It is still waiting, and this is where I want to make a distinction that I consider essential to the psychological honesty of what I am describing. The individuation process, which is what I have been circling throughout this lecture without naming it directly, because its name is less important than its phenomenology. Individuation is not a project, it is not a decision, it cannot be undertaken as a program of self-improvement or executed as a series of therapeutic steps. It is, rather, something that happens to you when the conditions for its occurrence are finally met, when the wound has been sufficiently examined, when the shadow has been sufficiently acknowledged, when the persona has been sufficiently loosened from its identification with the self. What happens is not dramatic. I want to be clear about this, because the cultural imagination of psychological transformation is almost always too large, too sudden, too visible. What I have observed in patients who moved through this process is not a conversion experience. It is more like, and I will use this comparison carefully, the gradual return of sensation to a limb that was for a long time without circulation. Not pleasure, initially, often, in fact, something closer to pain. The pain of blood returning to tissue that was numb, the discomfort of a nervous system relearning its own signals. The desire, when it returns, does not arrive as certainty, it arrives as preference. Small, almost embarrassingly small preferences. This rather than that, this person's company, not that one's, this kind of silence, not the performative silence of someone managing their response to you, but the genuine silence of someone who does not need you to be anything other than what you are. The desire returns in increments, and each increment is, in its way, both modest and revolutionary, because each increment is a moment in which the self has actually chosen, from its own interior, without the wound's guidance, something that belongs to it. I want to speak now about what happens to the relationships when this process continues. Not the relationships that were purely extractive, those tend to fall away of their own weight, unable to sustain themselves once the supply of compulsive attunement is withdrawn. I am speaking about the relationships that contain something genuine alongside the wound-based arrangement, the ones where there was real care, real history, real mutual recognition, embedded inside a structure that was also simultaneously exploitative of the mechanism These relationships do not simply survive or fail. They undergo a renegotiation that neither party may be entirely conscious of. And the renegotiation is almost always painful for both, because the person on the other side of the relationship, the one who was, in varying degrees, dependent on the mechanism, must now learn to tolerate something they were never required to tolerate before. They must tolerate you as a person rather than as a function. And a person, an actual, interior, desire having, angular carrying, boundary possessing person is significantly more difficult to be in relationship with than a mechanism. A mechanism is reliable. A mechanism does not disappoint you by having needs of its own. A mechanism does not occasionally fail to register your distress because it is occupied with its own. A person does all of these things, and some people who believed they loved you will discover, when confronted with the actual person rather than the wound's performance of personhood, that what they loved was the mechanism, not consciously, not maliciously, but definitively, and the relationship, once this is visible, cannot be what it was. It may become something else, something smaller, something more honest, something with less warmth but more reality. Or it may simply end, not in rupture, but in the quiet, mutual recognition that what held it together is no longer operative. I have watched this occur. I have watched people lose relationships they valued in the wake of this process, not because they became cruel or withholding, but simply because they became real. And the loss is genuine. The grief of it is genuine. I do not want to minimize that, but I also want to name what the loss reveals that the relationship was with the wound. And the wound is no longer willing to be the self. Now, let me speak about the symbols I have carried through this lecture, because they have arrived at their final meaning. The tuning fork. I introduced it in the first movement as the image of a nervous system trained to resonance, made for vibration, unable to refuse a frequency. By the time we reach this fourth movement, the tuning fork has not been destroyed. It has not been silenced. What has changed is the relationship between the fork and its resonance. The fork that vibrates compulsively, that cannot distinguish between a frequency it has chosen and a frequency it has been subjected to, that fork is being replaced, slowly, by something that retains the sensitivity but recovers the agency, not insensitivity, selectivity, the capacity to resonate with what one chooses to resonate with. Because the self is now present enough to choose. This is not, I want to be clear, a final achievement. It is a capacity under development. It will be imperfect. There will be relapses into the old compulsive vibration moments when the childhood frequency is activated and the fork responds before the self has had time to intervene. This is not failure. It is the natural condition of a nervous system in transition. And transition does not proceed in a straight line. The sutured skin, the wound that was closed too early, before the infection beneath it cleared. By this fourth movement, the skin has opened, the infection has become visible, and the process of genuine healing, which is slower, messier, and less presentable than the original suture, has begun. Genuine healing leaves a different kind of scar than premature suturing. It is thicker, less smooth, more visible. but it is a scar that forms over tissue that has actually cleared. It holds differently, not because it is harder, but because it is honest about what it is. And the closed hand, this symbol, which I introduced as evidence that a self exists, that there is, finally, a hand that can close, arrives in this final movement at its full meaning. The closed hand is not permanently closed. It was never the point that it close and remain closed. The point was that it could close, that the closing was possible, that the self was real enough to have a boundary that was not chosen in crisis, but structural, not a reaction, but a fact. What the closed hand holds, when it finally opens on its own terms, in its own time, without the compulsion of the wound or the pressure of others' need, is not what was there before. What was there before was the mechanism's endless availability, the wound's product packaged as generosity. What is in the hand now is something smaller and more actual. It is what the self genuinely has to give, not everything that was ever asked of it, not the infinite supply of attunement that the wound produced, the actual, finite, chosen offering of a self that has finally become real enough to give from its own substance rather than from its own depletion. I want to address, in these final pages, the question of what I have called structural presence, because I used that phrase in the third movement and left it there, and it requires completion. Structural presence is what becomes available when the individuation process has proceeded far enough that the self is no longer organized primarily around the wound. It is not the absence of sensitivity. It is sensitivity that has been reclaimed from compulsion and returned to choice. It is the capacity to be genuinely affected by another person's reality, to feel it, to be moved by it, without that being moved constituting an automatic obligation to manage it. The feeling and the obligation have been separated. This separation is, in my view, one of the most significant psychological achievements available to a person with this specific history, because it was precisely the fusion of feeling and obligation, the trained equation of sensitivity with responsibility, that kept the mechanism in place long after the original wound had lost its context. When the feeling and the obligation are separated, something becomes possible that was not possible before: genuine witness, not management, not the sophisticated, wound-born capacity to know what another person needs and provide it before they ask, but something quieter and, I would argue, more genuinely human, the capacity to be present to another person's experience without immediately organizing that presence around what they require from you. This is what actual love, as opposed to the wound's performance of love, feels like from the inside. It is less smooth. It is less reliably comforting. It does not anticipate. It does not manage. It is present, genuinely present, with all the friction and limitation and occasional failure that genuine presence entails. But it is contact, actual contact between two actual selves, and contact of that quality, even briefly, even imperfectly, is worth more than decades of the wound's exquisite, exhausting, self-erasing imitation of it. I want to return, at the end, to the dream, the room whose door opens only from the outside, the figure speaking without being heard. I have asked you to hold this dream across the length of this lecture, and now I want to tell you what I believe it is actually describing. It is not describing abandonment. It is not describing cruelty. It is not even Precisely. Describing protection as if the room were a refuge from a threatening outside. What the room is describing is the interior. For the first time in perhaps your entire psychological history, you are on the interior side of your own life. The figure on the other side of the door, the appeal, the guilt, the grief, the accusation, the role, the function, the arrangement, all of it is outside, not destroyed, not rejected, outside, and you are inside, in a room that has, until now, been empty of you, a room you did not know you had, a room that has been waiting with the specific patience of the unlived life for the self that was always its rightful occupant. The door opens only from the outside. This is not a permanent condition. It is the condition of a particular moment in a particular process. The door will, in time, become a door like other doors, one that can be opened from either side. By choice, with full knowledge of what is being opened and to whom and why, but not yet, not now. Now the door opens only from the outside, and you are inside. And this is not a tragedy. It is the first fact about you that is entirely your own. The figure outside is still speaking. You can see this. You know, with the full precision of the wound's training, exactly what they are saying and exactly what they feel. Nothing about your perception has failed. Nothing about your capacity for understanding has diminished. What has changed is only this: the knowing no longer requires you to act. The understanding no longer constitutes a debt. The sensitivity traced back, finally, to its origin in the wound no longer owns you. You are in the room. The room is yours. The door opens only from the outside. This is what has completed inside you. Not healing, not recovery, not the transformation of the wound into wisdom, or the darkness into light, or the survival architecture into something that can finally be called a life freely chosen, something more specific than any of that, and in its specificity, more durable. The self that was continuously deferred has stopped deferring. It did not announce this. It did not ask permission. It did not wait for the right moment or the right relationship or the right degree of understanding from those around it. It simply stopped, the way a thing that has been held under pressure stops when the pressure is finally more than the holding can sustain. You did not do this. It was done in you, and it will not be undone.